So hi guys, it's Alex here, and today we're going to be talking about the main possibility, the so-called Polerio Defense. This is the main option for black when white plays this early knight g5 move. So let's put that position on the board. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to c4, knight to f6, and here we're talking about this move knight to g5, which we've been covering for the last couple of videos. And now black plays the move pawn to d5 to deal with the threat, and e takes d5. And here the main option for black is this move knight a5, simply attacking the bishop and for now not seeking to recover the pawn immediately. In fact, if white were to do something like, let's say, bishop to e2, black would have a very good position because he would capture the pawn back and then eventually bring the knight back, and his position would be very good with a nice central pawn. And so this is not in white's interest. So what white does is he gives this check on b5, and this invites black to play the move pawn to c6. This is the main line. Now white takes the pawn on c6, and after b takes c6, we can see that white is in fact up a pawn, and it would look like it's a very good situation for him because this pawn is isolated and this knight is here on the side of the board. So at first sight it looks very good. But it turns out that this position is very much playable and actually quite nice for the black side because of the better situation in the center, the somewhat loose knight here on g5, which we'll see can be targeted by black, and the easier development and slight space advantage given by this central pawn. So let's take a look at what typically happens here. Well, we've split the material into the old main line, the traditional main line, which is the move bishop to e2. But before we look at this, we're going to look at the somewhat unusual retreat, bishop to d3. It looks a bit strange to put your bishop in front of the pawn on d2. And finally, we'll also look at a move that seeks to exploit the undefended rook on a8, and that's the move queen f3. The idea here is that if black now captures the bishop on b5, the rook on a8 would fall. So let's begin, in fact, with this move, queen to f3. Here, after the move queen f3, black plays rook to b8. This is a funky move because it offers a second pawn, but in fact, it turns out that maybe white's best move is just bishop to d3. If white captures the second pawn instead, black actually will take on c6, queen will take on c6, and after the move knight d7, black may be down 2 pawns, but he has the bishop pair, he has an attack on the knight on g5, he even has the move bishop to b7, he has great piece activity, his rook, for example, is on a semi-open file, and look at white's lag in development and for now uncastled king. So this position is not considered to be so good for white. Therefore, after the move rook b8, white usually avoids taking the pawn on c6 and instead retreats the bishop to d3. Black here plays the move bishop to e7, and after white castles, white attempts to complete his development here with the move pawn to b3 because he cannot develop this bishop via the c1 to h6 diagonal. So he goes b3 instead. And now a very nice move from black, which is important to know if you are playing this line as black, and that is this move rook to b4. We talked earlier about the fact that this knight on g5 is quite vulnerable. And here in this position, black actually threatens to slide the rook over to the king's side, play the move rook g4, and cause problems to this knight in combination with an attack against the white king. Therefore, white's best move is pawn c4, which keeps this rook out of the game, but it does mean that this pawn is now a backward pawn, that this bishop is no longer as well defended, and also that the d4 square is now firmly in black's control because, for example, white can never play the pawn back to c3 to cover the d4 square. So black actually uses these things and after h6, knight goes to e4, knight takes knight, bishop takes knight, and here f5, when black has this very strong center, and when white moves his bishop, black will have ideas like pushing the pawn to e4, and also at some point, let's say bishop c2, pawn to e4, at some point black will threaten ideas like bishop f6 or queen d4, depending on how the game progresses. As well as this, black has a very nice possibility for an attack on the king side. Therefore, this whole line with queen f3, it's a nice idea to try and surprise your opponent, but if black, if the player with the black pieces is prepared, then I don't think you're going to get a big advantage as white. So let's take a step back, and now we're going to talk instead about the second most popular move, which is bishop to d3. So we'll set that position up. So now let's take a look at the first of two bishop retreats, which are bishop to d3 and bishop to e2. So let's look at bishop d3. This was kind of a trendy idea for some time because the white player realized that the bishop on e2 had problems, that we are about to see very soon. And so they said, well, look, we'll put the bishop on d3 in front of the pawn, and we'll just maybe develop our dark squared bishop with b3, and slowly but surely we'll develop our queen side, and at the end of the day we have an extra pawn. The problem is that with correct play, black actually is in good shape here. So the best move after bishop d3, in my opinion, is just the natural move knight to d5. This attacks the knight on g5, and it would really be too dangerous for white to go pawn grabbing here on h7. So white's best move is knight to f3. If he were to go to e4, then f5, this idea that we've already seen, would enable black to gain a lot of time and advance in the center, and would give white a lot of problems. So knight goes to f3. Now bishop to d6, black just calmly develops, still a pawn down. White goes castle, and now the big problem of this variation. Black has this move knight to f4. And actually the white bishop just can't move to any good square, really. Because if the white bishop goes to e2, then by not controlling the e4 square, black now can actually push with e4 and create really a lot of problems for white in the center and on the king side. So because of this, white actually, I should add that if the bishop goes to e4, black again has this typical idea of pawn to f5, hitting the bishop, and the pawn on c6 is being defended by the knight. So because of this, the way that the line is played by white is usually rook to e1, and now black takes the opportunity to take off this bishop, and not only does black now secure for himself the bishop pair, but on top of that, the white structure is really very badly shattered. Black now castles, and in this position, white has a variety of options, but most of the time they play knight to c3. Now black takes the opportunity to defend the pawn on e5, and now after knight e4, black usually continues with the move c5, fixing his control over d4 and also creating a square for the knight to return to the game sooner or later. This is where we're going to end our analysis of this variation, and well, what I can say is that the position is roughly playable for both sides, actually. It's playable for white, certainly. I don't think white is worse, because white is up a pawn. But overall, I also don't think white is better because, as mentioned, the white pawn structure is very badly damaged. Black has nice control of the center, and the black bishop pair, in particular, this unopposed light squared bishop. By unopposed, I mean that white has no counterpart since black captured it on d3. This position overall gives all of these different assets give black just about enough compensation and perhaps the easier game to play. So this is a quick look at this secondary line of bishop d3, and we'll finish the video with a look at the traditional main line bishop e2. So I'll put that position on the board now. So here, as I said, we've now looked at bishop d3, and we looked at queen f3 before that. Now we're going to look at the move bishop to e2. In the past, after bishop e2, black would usually start with the move h6, which is a useful move, and the knight now has only two squares available to it. If it goes to e4, it would of course be captured. Knight h3 is a move that has been played quite a bit, so it's worth a mention, but I won't spend too much time on it because the knight here is just a little bit misplaced. It doesn't really have any knight moves and it's vulnerable to being captured at any given time. I wouldn't recommend that you do capture it immediately. Instead, I would recommend black play natural moves such as bishop d6, castle, maybe put the knight in the center on d5, just develop normally. And we can say that black has a better central situation, better piece placement, and from there he will have compensation. It's a relatively straightforward way to play for black. So maybe the more critical choice is if the knight goes to f3. Now after this, black continues his assault on the knight with the move e4, and white here should go knight to e5. Now, the old main line, I think, gives some nice chances for white. So if you're interested in playing this from the white side, then what I would recommend is that you definitely study after the move bishop d6, study which option do you prefer as white, whether to defend the knight with d4 or whether to defend the knight with f4. This leads to quite interesting positions. I'm not going to claim that white is better or significantly better, but I like it less for black than what I consider the most challenging black option, and that is the move bishop c5. Now this repertoire overall is intended for people who may play it from the white side and also from the black side, but at every turn I like to really draw attention to the lines that I think are, best represent best play for one side or the other. So in this case, I think bishop c5 merits a little bit more attention because I think it's the best move. So if you are interested in this repertoire from the black side, I recommend you look at this. And if you're interested from the white side, then I recommend you seriously consider what you're going to do after bishop c5. So bishop c5, now the problem is d4 is not an option because you can capture the pawn. And if on the other hand f4, this would really leave white with some serious problems because now the bishop is ideally placed on the long diagonal here from g1 to a7, and white is going to have very serious problems with his king for the rest of the game. So therefore, after bishop c5, what white usually does is he plays c3. In this way, he controls the d4 square because if it were black's move in this position, black could have played queen d4, attacking both f2, threatening checkmate, and the knight on e5. So instead, white plays the move c3, which stops this and prepares d4. Black here can play the move queen c7, attacking the knight, forcing white to play a move such as d4. And now in this position, black captures en passant. The knight is under attack, so white must recapture with the knight to make sure he doesn't lose a piece. And now black simply drops the bishop back and makes a battery with the queen. Now we understand the logic behind this move queen c7. We make a battery here, and this prevents white from being able to castle. So white instead brings his queen's knight out and looks to place it perhaps on f3 soon and eventually castle. But in this position after castle, I would consider that although if we look at it, we're still down a pawn as black, the white pieces are all a little bit bunched up here, and black has already castled, while white still cannot castle because of the threat on h2. Black will be able to get onto the central files quicker, his pieces are overall better coordinated, and in short, all of these different assets that black has or imbalances in black's favor means that the pawn is certainly compensated. If you don't believe me, by all means, like in any position that we look at, I encourage you guys can throw up this position on your board or with your own computer at home and investigate it further. But overall, black here, I think objectively speaking, is doing well. So this brings us to the end of our look at the Polerio Defense, which is the most popular line, so certainly worth spending time on. and we looked at these three options, the two bishop retreats either to d3 or e2, and as well prior to that we had seen this funky queen f3 move, profiting from the rook being undefended. So hopefully you enjoyed this coverage so far of this two knights defense, and I hope to see you in the next video.